Hello and welcome to this React and GraphQL course where we are going to be building a front-end application that hits a GraphQL server giving us back data for Pokemon characters. So let's jump in. Who am I? Well, I'm a full-time programmer / technical lead. I work on various entertainment websites that include video streaming services here in the UK. I also teach workshops, do JavaScript and React in classroom sessions, and I'm also a teacher, so I teach one-on-one React and JavaScript courses. So I'm a huge fan of JavaScript, and I kind of have this pragmatic programming ethos where if we can ship a feature, I would prefer to do that as opposed to look at over-engineering an application. So I'm more of a feature-based developer, if that's included in the sphere of programming these days. But I'm very pragmatic. I like to get things done. So here we are. We're going to be looking at how we can build a React and GraphQL front-end application. We're going to get straight to the point. We're going to have some fun interactive code that we can work towards and we can ship something quickly. I also upload video tutorials on YouTube. My channel is Cognitive Surge, so feel free to go ahead and check out my courses there and feel free to subscribe. So I'm sure you're eager to wonder what we're going to be developing here. We're going to be developing this application. It looks fairly simple, but we're using some really, really great technologies under the hood here, like React, GraphQL, Apollo. We're not going to be creating a GraphQL server because that's our limits for this tutorial, but we're going to be hitting an existing GraphQL server. And I'm going to be showing you how you can interact with GraphQL by making GraphQL queries. We're going to be looking at Apollo hooks. We're going to be using the method of having a container, components, and we're going to be styling this application. Now, some of this stuff may not make sense to you if you're new to React or if you're new to GraphQL, Apollo, but we're going to be jumping into what these things mean and how we can use them to our advantage to build a fast application with a very limited amount of code. So what technologies are we going to be using? I've kind of already touched on this, but we're going to be using the latest React. We're going to be using the latest GraphQL server that's already open to us. We're going to be using Apollo so we can make some GraphQL queries. We're going to be using CSS. And ultimately, at the end, we're going to be building on top of a GraphQL server. And that basically means we're going to be hitting a GraphQL server just like you do with regular APIs. We'll have one URL and we're going to be hitting that. So this Pokemon Open API is accessible to anybody. Of course, there's going to be a linear structure in there. So feel free to go check out that GraphQL server. Look at how the queries are structured. Look at how the fields are structured. Inner objects, just see how the structure of the server works, because that's how we're going to be making our GraphQL calls. So how is this course going to work? Well, if you are new to Scrimba, you are in for a great experience because this is incredibly unique. You can basically code along with me and I can give you interactive learning methods that are cohesive. So if I'm going to be coding along, you can follow, you can jump in, you can change the code. I'm going to be giving you some really nice challenges because I want you to build that muscle memory up and we can solutionize the problem that we're trying to solve. The problem in this sense, we're going to bring a solution as to how we can build an application that pulls data from a GraphQL server. On the front end, as mentioned, we're going to be using React, and React's going to work really well for us. And we can do this in a very, very limited amount of code because we've got some great technologies that we're going to be using. So how we're going to be tackling this, we're going to be doing an initial setup. I'm going to be creating the files, the folders, getting all the dependencies. So to make this work, we are going to have to add as a dependency React, GraphQL, GraphQL tag, Apollo, those sort of things. We'll have a much more in-depth video for you for this particular scenario. We're going to also be going into doing the boilerplate code, so creating things like containers, creating things like components, getting all those set up, and then we'll start adding our code to those particular files. Moreover, we're going to be looking at how we can connect to GraphQL server. So we're going to be using Apollo, and this is incredibly simple to set up. It may seem very technical online when you've looked at other tutorials, videos, blog posts, whatever it may be, but I'm going to be walking you through this. So don't worry, I'm going to be there every step of the way, and we're going to get this application built. So we're going to be moving on from, once we've created the GraphQL server, to creating our components, creating the cards that you may see for the Pokemon. So you can pull out, say, the health, the crit points, the attributes that a Pokemon has. And the great thing about using a Pokemon standard here, well, Pokemon standard, a Pokemon character, is that they have many standards and many methods. So like attack methods, defense methods, all this sort of stuff. So it's going to be really cool to be pulling this out, and it gives some good complexity to the data that's being retrieved. Next, we're going to be styling our application. So once we've got everything set up, we've got all the data, we're going to be styling the application, making sure it's responsive. And after that, we can give ourselves a pat on the back because we've completed a React and Apollo and a GraphQL course. And of course, in between all of this, there's going to be lots of cool challenges. So let's go ahead, let's do this. Let's create our React, our Apollo, our GraphQL application, and let's pull out those Pokemon. So let's go ahead, let's do this, and I shall see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome to this installing our dependencies and boilerplate code. So what we're going to have to be doing in this video is we're going to have to be installing our dependencies. So I'm quickly going to go ahead and install the dependencies, and then we'll take a look how we can set up the files and folders. So the dependencies that I'm going to be adding are basically the GraphQL ones and the React ones. So you'll see them on the left appearing. So we need React at 16.13.0. Basically, what this allows us to do is use things like React, use things like GraphQL, use things like Apollo, and it gives us the power to build on top of certain technologies that other people have been nice enough to build and release. So we've got React hooks installed, we have GraphQL tag, we have React. There's a few other things that we do need. So we're going to need like React DOM. We're going to need GraphQL tags so we can build queries and send them to the GraphQL server. And once we have these, the best thing we can do is give ourselves a good skeleton structure. And what I mean by that is we're going to go ahead and basically build out an application that we can use to call a GraphQL server, but we want it to be in such a state that works well, not just as a small application, but we want to think about how this could potentially scale in the future. So we have our dependencies. There's a few things that we're going to be needing here. So on the left, you'll see I have index.html and index.js. Now, I have a certain way that I like to use React. And generally speaking, what I like to do, I'll import React in index.js. And then you'll want to import that from React. And then you don't have to do this generally, but I like to import the render as a named import. And then I'll get that from React DOM. Next, I will get app from /app. And you're probably asking at this point, this file does not exist. It doesn't, but I like to give myself the indication as to where I'm going to be pulling this from. So when you're rendering out a component, the main component, generally people call this app. And in this case, I've done a named import. And then I'm going to say render. I'm going to pass it the application component. So that means now, well, it tells me now that we're going to have to go ahead and create this file. If we go ahead and click new file, I'm going to do app.js. Now we have app.js on the left side now, which means this is basically our core component. And if we just go ahead and import React from React, and this is the one that's getting rendered out first, there's a few things that we're going to have to import here. But right now, let's not worry too much about that. Let's take a look at index.html. So what is this index.html? Well, what happens here is that you'll generally have, that's just a standard index.html file. But what we're going to be doing is in the head, we do need a style sheet. So we're going to say link rel equals style sheet. And then we're going to say href app.css. We're going to take down this script and we're going to put it in the body. So it's non-blocking to some extent. Then we'll say div ID equals root because we want to target that. And if you jump back over to index.js, you'll see that document.getElementById root, and that's where we're going to load in our main app.component. So next, what we're going to be doing, I'm going to create another folder. I'm going to call this components. I'm going to create another folder after that, call it containers. And then I'm going to create a GraphQL folder for all our GraphQL queries. Next, we want a app.css. And to me, that's starting to look pretty good. So we have components, containers. We do need our GraphQL folder as well. And that looks perfect. So we have index.html, index.js, app.js, app.css, GraphQL folder, containers, components. So we have our skeleton built now. Let's take a look at how we can start building this out in the next video. So in this video, we're going to be looking at how we can interact more with Scrimba, how we can check out the little browser window that you see here on the right. Furthermore, we are going to be looking at setting up our application so we can give some life to our application. So let's jump in. Let's take a look at where we currently stand. So if we click on the console down on the bottom left, you'll see that we're getting a few errors here. It's nothing too major, and that's good. It's basically just alerting us that in our index.js, we're asking for the app from the app file. But in this case, we're not doing anything with the app file. So let's go ahead here and do export function, and then we'll just return. And the return in React is just going to return some simple HTML. So we can just say, I am a Pokemon. Let's close off that tag. And then if you come up to the top right and click run code/reload, we can start getting some validation. So there we are. It says, I am a Pokemon, which is great. So moving on, we want to start now looking at how we can interact, well, get the user to interact with our application. So we need a few things here. And the first one being is we do have to set up the Apollo client. We did install the dependency for the Apollo client. So let's go ahead and import that. So let's do import Apollo client from Apollo Boost. We added Apollo Boost as a dependency, and now we can use that. Now, Apollo allows us basically to hit an external GraphQL API. You can hit external GraphQL APIs just by using, the regular REST route where you can just make HTTP calls. So like if you did a GET or a POST, you can effectively do that. And under the hood of Apollo, you'll see pretty much the code is doing that. So if we go down here and we do const, and we'll say client equals new Apollo client. And what we're going to do, we're going to initialize this client with a URI, and then we'll give it the Pokemon GraphQL server. And now the URL I'm going to use is https://GraphQL-Pokemon.now.sh. That is effectively a GraphQL server where you're going to be hitting, and you can take that URL, open it up in a tab, take a look. You can look through the structure of the GraphQL server, and it'll give you a good understanding as to what data we can pull out. Moving on, what we have to do now is we want to use the Apollo client as a component. We basically want to wrap our application in something called Apollo provider. That Apollo provider takes a prop called client, and we've just created the client. So we're just going to pass that to that component. So let's do Apollo provider. We're going to wrap our application from the top level of app component because we want from the top level the access throughout our entire application to the GraphQL server. So let's give it a prop of client, and then we'll close that tag. Next, we want to go ahead and close the component tag. And you'll see here, you must be thinking, okay, I can see the Apollo provider, but why are we not importing that? And that's a great spot. So I want you now to go ahead and try import this. We did import the Apollo provider from @Apollo/React hooks. So this is a name component, which is Apollo provider, like so. So I'm going to pause the video in just a second, and I want you to go ahead and import this. Try your best to do this. If you don't succeed, that's fine. And if you do succeed, fantastic. But let's go ahead. I'll pause this particular video and try and import this yourself. And you should be really, 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 really proud if you manage to do this, because not many people first starting out, especially to web development, can conceptualize what React is, conceptualize how Apollo can help us. And even trying to get the understanding of a GraphQL server, it's very, very hard. So don't be hard on yourself. Go ahead, try and import this. I'll pause the video now, and I shall see you in a few seconds with the solution. So I'm back. Let's take a look how we can import this. So we have a name component. We can click up here, create some space just to make it easier to read. So we'll do import. And since it's a named import, we'll do Apollo provider. And then we'll say from @Apollo/React -hooks. And there we are. We now have our Apollo provider. And it was a little challenge. Hopefully you managed to do that. If not, that's fine. And you may be looking at it like thinking, why has this one got curly braces and these haven't? Well, these are default exports, and you can pull in defaults basically by just doing export default. You'll see here I've done export function app, and that's a named export. If I was to just do export, say default, that'll be in a default fashion. But the reason people tend to do named exports is because you could have a bunch of other things that you want to import. So you could do Apollo hooks, Apollo something 1, Apollo something 2. So it's really helpful when you have the named one because you can import multiple. So let's go ahead, just clean this up, get rid of those comments. And now we have the Apollo provider. Let's put this in a main tag so we can style this later on and we know everything will be in main. And next we will need some sort of container because we're going to have a bunch of Pokemons and we want to loop over those Pokemons. So I always go down the route of creating a container for anything that has a loop inside. So we have Pokemon's container. This does not exist, so we're going to have to import this again, but we cannot import something currently because it will break the application that doesn't exist. So I'm going to go to, let's take a look here, containers, new file, and I'll call this one Pokemon's container.js. And in Pokemon's container.js, there's a bunch of stuff that has to happen. So we're going to have to import React from React, and you'll find yourself doing that quite a lot. And just to make sure this kind of doesn't break the application or gives us a bit of life, what we can do here is we can go ahead and essentially just, let's do export function actually. Let's go ahead and just make sure it doesn't break. So we can just return some standard export return, and we'll do some simple HTML. Pokemon, I am a Pokemon container. And I tend to do this just to make sure that we're getting access to the file, everything's working correctly. So now we have Pokemon's container. Likewise, what we did previously, we need to actually import this. And if we jump into this app.js file, we can do this as a named import. So we'll do Pokemon's container from / because we need to go up one level, containers, Pokemon's container. And even though I say you have to go up one level here, essentially this is just saying relative. So wherever I am, just hit the folder that's on the same level. So we'll get it from containers, Pokemon containers. If we go ahead and run code, reload, we should hopefully have something in there. I am a Pokemon container. Brilliant. So we now know that works. So perfect. We have a container set up. We have the Apollo client set up, and we have some life in our application. We know that we are using the Apollo provider now, passing in the client as a prop, and we now have access to the GraphQL Pokemon server. So well done on that. We have come a long way, even just by getting the Apollo client set up, understanding what Apollo is. Basically, to conclude on that, it just gives us life to the application. And when I say life, it allows us to have direct access to that GraphQL server. And without that, there's not much really to our application because that is where all our data lives. So well done once again, and I shall see you in the next video. So let's talk about GraphQL. In this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at the GraphQL server that we're going to be using. So if you visit https graphql-pokemon.now.sh, you will see this graphical playground. If you click on the docs on the right, you'll get something called the Schema Explorer. And what the Schema Explorer is, it's essentially just mapping out everything that you can request. So let's go ahead, click on docs, and we shall see. Once you've clicked on docs, you should come to this screen. This screen will show your queries. And in some cases, if you have mutations, if you do not know, basically just allow you to update and edit and delete. Queries is just requesting information. So we're going to go through the Document Explorer, click on query, because it's saying, look, we have some queries set up, and I'm going to show you the queries. So once we click on the query, we can take a look at the fields that we can query against. So here we can see what we can query for. So we have query, Pokemons, and Pokemon. The one we're going to be using is Pokemons. So you can see on the right, we have Pokemons, and then it says first int exclamation mark. Well, what does that mean? That's basically saying, look, I need to take a variable, and that variable has to be an integer. And if you look closely, you can see it has an exclamation mark. That exclamation mark means this is required. Furthermore, to the right of that, you will see brackets Pokemon, and that's essentially saying I'm going to return you an array of Pokemons. We don't know what Pokemons is yet, so we don't know what sort of fields we can query against, but we can take a closer look into that. Lastly, if you look at the singular Pokemon, which is just below Pokemons, that takes an ID and name. These are not required, even though without them, you're not going to find a Pokemon because you're trying to identify Pokemon and get the data back for that particular Pokemon. Albeit, it does return one singular Pokemon. This one does not get returned in an array. As you can see, it doesn't have the brackets around. The first one, which is Pokemon's, does. So GraphQL is pretty much all about asking for specific fields on an object. And what I mean by that is we can request whatever information we want and we can get that information returned, whether we want more information, if that's possible, or less information. Whereas with something like REST, you get all the information back. And sometimes you don't need all that information. The great thing about GraphQL is that it'll tell you what you can request for and what it will return. So you can see on the right here, as mentioned, we do get arguments that we can pass in. In our case, we are going to be utilizing this first integer. We are going to be passing 9 because we want 9 Pokemons, and we will get 9 Pokemons returned. However, we don't know what fields are going to be returned just yet. So what I want to do is I want to click inside this Explorer, click on the Pokemon, and you can check exactly what fields will be returned. So, having clicked on the Pokemon, you can see we have a bunch of fields. So we have ID, number, name, weight, classification. There's a bunch of stuff in here that we do need, and there's a bunch of stuff in here that we don't need. And as mentioned, one of the powerful things about GraphQL is we can just request the fields that we need, which is fantastic. So here we have built a query. We put all our queries on the left. Generally speaking, if you do a query in here, and you can just copy and paste this into your JavaScript file using GraphQL tag, and it's pretty much done. So once you've got the query that you need from GraphQL and you've built it up, you can go ahead and just copy and paste this. And in this case, this is what we're going to be doing. So I'm requesting ID, name, image, max HP, max CP, and then attacks, special, and damage. And you can see how I've gone inside for attacks because attacks is an object. And I'm going to go inside the attacks object, and then I find a special object. And then inside there is where I can request further fields for the stuff that I need. And that's it. Having clicked run, you can see we have data. So congratulations. These are the fields requested on the left, and GraphQL has returned us the data on the right. So that's pretty much it. That's all we need to be able to request data. And as you can see, it works pretty well. GraphQL has some huge advantages, and it's a fantastic piece of technology, and we're going to be utilizing this in our application. So welcome back. We are now going to be looking at how we can use the Apollo client, Apollo provider, creating containers, and we're even going to take a little bit of a deep dive into what GraphQL really is. So if we jump over here, you can see in the previous video, we set up our Apollo client, our Apollo provider. So now the app is the component that we include within the index.js, and we essentially are saying, look, this is our main component. What that means is if you think of this as a building block, we have the app at the top and everything else below will have access to the Apollo provider because we have basically returned it here. What we want to do here now is you'll see that we have I am a Pokemon container here following on from the last video. And we have the containers folder with a Pokemon container right here. So what we want to do now is if you go take a look at the GraphQL API, if you just open that up, you'll see inside there you have essentially an object and you'll have a data object. Within that data object, depending on what you request from that GraphQL API, you could have a singular Pokemon or you could have an array of Pokemons. In our case, we want an array of Pokemons. So what we're going to do, we're going to jump into the Pokemon's container and we're going to import use query. And that's essentially a hook in React. And we're saying, give us that from the Apollo package and we want it from the React hooks Apollo dependency. Next, we're basically going to say import Pokemon from -- components Pokemon. In here, this is where the juicy technical aspect comes in. So if you go check the Apollo documentation, you'll see they give you a quick demo as to how to essentially put together a query. A query is essentially just saying, look, this is what I'm asking for. Please return me the data. In GraphQL, you can either have one or two things returned, or even two things. So you could get the data back and you could get an array of errors back. Having both of those makes GraphQL a really, really viable technology. So we could get an object of data back and that object could be empty. We could get errors back with a bunch of errors in there, and that's fine. We know something's happened. It's good to take a look at that. So if we get an object back of errors and there's a bunch of errors in there that we have to take care of, that's fine. Right now we want to take a look at how we can get the data back from our Pokemon GraphQL API. And the way to do this is we're going to say const, and we're going to destructure immediately from data. We know data is going to be there regardless if it comes back empty, but we do want to protect ourselves. So what we're going to do here, we're going to destructure and we're going to say Pokemons. And I know Pokemons is coming back because I've checked the GraphQL API. You can get Pokemon back or you can get Pokemons. We've requested, or we are going to request, that we get Pokemons back. And if you, as mentioned, take a look at the GraphQL API, you'll see that you can get an array of Pokemons back. We're going to default this Pokemons to an empty array. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, I want the data to default if there's no data there for some strange reason to an empty object. And this is basically just protecting us from our application bombing out. And when I say bombing out, it's essentially saying we don't want our application to break, so it's always good to have some backup. And I always like to make sure my application's safe and it's not going to break. And I'm going to say here, use query, and I'm going to pass in as the first argument, get underscore Pokemons. And what is get underscore Pokemons? Because when you're taking a look at this, you'll see it doesn't exist. Well, get underscore Pokemons is essentially going to be a string, and it's going to be a GraphQL string with a query inside. We're going to say inside that string, we want the Pokemons back, and then we're going to start providing fields like the name of the Pokemon, the health of the Pokemon, the crit percentage of the Pokemon, the attributes of the Pokemon. So we're going to be doing that very shortly, but right now let's just put that in there and pretend it exists. Secondly, the second argument that comes into use query is the variables. And variables is something like, for example, if you're doing pagination, you want to get all the results for the second page, we can pass up page equals 2. In this case, we're going to pass the variables first equals 9. What that means, again, if you go ahead and check out the GraphQL server, you'll see it takes arguments, and those arguments, one of them being first. I'm going to say, give me the first 9 results so that I don't get like 100 Pokemons back and the application becomes slow. So let's put a semicolon there. Hopefully that makes sense. It's just structuring out from use query. There's some fantastic examples on the Apollo website, but that's essentially how I like to set out my application. We've got some fallback just in case. And then in the return statement, we're going to go ahead, just do some standard React here. Just say div class name equals container. In React, we cannot use the property of class because that is restricted, so we have to use class name. Next, I'm going to say, okay, Pokemons, and. Okay, so what does and mean? It's basically saying if we have a truthy value, go ahead and do everything on the right of this, as opposed to using something like a ternary statement or an if statement or whatever it may be. We're just going to say, Pokemons, okay, it's there, do this, even if it's empty. So we'll say Pokemons.map, Pokemon, and then in here, we're going to say Pokemon, and we're just going to pass it the Pokemon component. Power of React comes in props and state. In this Pokemon component that you'll see here, you'll notice it doesn't exist because we did mention that earlier. We've imported it. It doesn't exist. Perfect. But in React, you have to pass, especially in a loop, like a map here. So we're doing .map. We're going to map over all the Pokemons, so we'll have 9 of them. I want you to know that the reconciliation algorithm within React, it has to identify a component. It has to identify how it's changed. So in this case, regardless if it's changing or not, you always have to pass a key to the component if you're looping over. So to do this, you have to put a key right here. And I want you to go ahead and do this. So instructions. Number 1, go ahead and add a key to the Pokemon component. Number 2, I also want you to pass a prop. So go ahead and pass a prop of a Pokemon. And you'll see right here, we're getting the Pokemon back as the return value because we're mapping over the Pokemon. So if you're going through 9 Pokemons, it'll go through 1. Okay, I know where that Pokemon is. Got it. Let's go to the next. Each time that comes back, I want you to pass it in to this Pokemon component. So essentially you'll have 9 Pokemons on the page. Each of them have been passed their specified props, 1 being the key, 1 being the Pokemon. Hopefully that makes sense. And remember, if this is maybe blowing your mind, everyone started from nowhere, right? Not everybody was born knowing React. Not everybody was born knowing JavaScript. It's just a simple fact. So I want you to go ahead and take a look at looping over using a map. But more specifically, I want you to add a key. And you'll be asking me now, well, where does this key come from? Well, a key has to be unique. A key has to be unique so that React can identify a particular component. In this case, we need some sort of unique identifier. And where does that come from? Well, again, if you reference the GraphQL server, each Pokemon is an object with a identifier of an ID. So it's perfect. They've set up this ID for us, so we can essentially say Pokemon.id. So 2 tasks, go ahead, add a key with Pokemon.id. Second, add another property, which is a Pokemon, passing down the Pokemon that gets looped over. Quick note on this. You can access your Pokemon props, and that's what we intend to do when we create that component, but you cannot access that key. And I've fallen in the trap of trying to access that key when I first started doing React and using it as like a unique identifier on the component, but you just cannot access it. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to pause the video here, go ahead and add a key and add the Pokemon. Good luck. So welcome back. Hopefully you managed to add the key and the prop of Pokemon. If you didn't, that's completely fine. I'm here to teach you React and JavaScript, right? And in this case, GraphQL and Apollo. So don't worry, I'm going to help you every step along the way. So if you didn't manage to do it, do not worry. Everybody, as I mentioned earlier, starts from somewhere. And trying to understand all these technologies in a video series is hard. It is not an easy task to do. So let's jump in right now and I'll show you how to do this. So on my first instructions, I said, go ahead and add a key to the Pokemon component. So we'll say key and we'll say Pokemon.id. Secondly, on the instructions, it says, go ahead and pass a prop of Pokemon. So I'll say Pokemon equals Pokemon. Remove that. And that's it. So it's that simple. And it's simple to me because I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times. It's not simple to someone who's never seen this before. So don't feel discouraged. If you managed to do that, fantastic. If you didn't, do not worry. This sort of stuff is I wouldn't say basics, but it's the fundamentals that we have to get and nail. So just remember, each time, create that muscle memory. Each time you're looping over and you've got another component, pass a key. And of course, we want it to be somewhat functional. So we're going to pass down the Pokemon data. So well done if you managed to do it. If you didn't, do not worry. We're going to be moving on. Do take a look at more information around keys and how they work in React. Look up the reconciliation algorithm, and it will very, very much give you a deep, deep understanding into how React works under the hood. So let's move on. We shall take a look next at how we can use the get Pokemons. We can create some GraphQL queries, the nice juicy stuff where we're going to be interacting with GraphQL. And then when that component's created, the Pokemon component, let's dump out that data and see how it looks. So well done for getting through this, and I shall see you in the next video. So welcome to this video where we're going to be building out our GraphQL query, the one everyone came for. So let's go ahead. On the left, I'm going to go ahead and create a file, the GraphQL file. We're just going to call it getPokemons.js. In this file, I'm going to import GQL from GraphQL tag. Oh, what's GraphQL tag? Well, it's essentially just a string. That's pretty much all it is. It's simple, the simplest minuscule core of the GraphQL tag. So we're going to do export const get Pokemons, because that's what we called it in the container. And we're just going to use a template string, GQL, give it 2 backticks, put that down there. Now, this is where we create the query. So we're going to say query, boom, done. That's pretty much where it is. And we're going to say we want the Pokemons. And if you remember previously, we had that variables second parameter, right? And now this is where it comes in. So we know that this takes some sort of parameter. So we have to define this. And the way you do this on your query in GraphQL is you do the $, and I'm going to pass now my variables. And GraphQL is like a type system. So I'm going to have to define specifically what sort of type it's going to be. So the first is going to be an integer. I'm going to use this little exclamation mark here to say it is in fact required. Clean this up a bit, and then we'll say with inside that query of Pokemons, I want the Pokemons. And now I'm going to say first and assign it to first, which is coming from here. So we're passing the first here as the actual first argument, and then we're going to pass in the variable first. And a great website to understand queries in GraphQL and just GraphQL in general. There's tons of resources out there, but of course, go look at the official documentation. GraphQL.org, fantastic as well. They've got some amazing documentation on there. And of course, look to the people who created some of the core of GraphQL. They have some great comments and some great documentation, like on their own websites and of course on GitHub. So at the core of it, what is GraphQL? GraphQL essentially allows us to just ask for specific fields on an object. That's all it is. So in this case, we have Pokemons in GraphQL. The person or the persons who created the GraphQL server have basically said, look, you can have Pokemons, and each Pokemon you can request from within Pokemons, but you have to tell us what you want. And what they mean by that is tell us what fields you want. So this is where the power of GraphQL really, really shines when you compare it to something like REST. And I'm going to say I want the ID because we're using ID for the key. Next, I'm going to say, well, I want the name. I want the image, of course. And I want the max HP, the max CP. And by the way, you can see all these fields by just accessing that GraphQL API directly. And then this is where it gets even more juicy. We can ask for specific fields on an object. So each Pokemon has an attack, and plural here, attacks, is an object. And I'm going to ask for fields on that object. And I'm going to say, oh, wait, attacks. I just looked at the GraphQL API. It turns out it's an object within an object. So I'm going to say, okay, well, give me the special attacks. And then I want the name, and then I want the damage. And well done. That's pretty much it. We have just written out a GraphQL query that we're going to be using to facilitate the data coming back to our front-end application. So previously on the Pokemon's container, which is this, we were using use Pokemons, and we didn't actually have the import done for get Pokemons. And you've done this before. You've imported so much stuff by now that you understand how named and default exports, well, named imports and named default imports work. So I want you to go ahead right now, go close the console down a little bit to give some more clarity to the page. And I want you to import get Pokemons from this GraphQL folder. So go ahead. If you get stuck, don't worry. We can cover that once more because we're going to be importing lots more stuff. But go ahead, try this now. I'll pause the video and I shall see you shortly. Welcome back. We are going to be importing our GraphQL template string. Pretty much it says GQL. It's essentially just a template string. That's all it is. And a template string is essentially a string that allows us to pass variables by just using a $sign. If you want more information on template strings, feel free to just go out there and look, get some more clarity around it. But that's pretty much all it is. We do import get Pokemons, and we'll say from, we're going to go up. Because we are in containers, we want to go out of containers and go into the GraphQL folder. GraphQL, get Pokemons. And there we are, we have access to this now. So what's going to happen here if we run this? So if I go to run code, I'm expecting it to error out because the component doesn't exist. There we are, it doesn't exist. Of course it doesn't. So let's go ahead, create the component, and we'll call this Pokemon.js. And that's fine. We just basically needed a pretty much a simple component. And this is going to be a dumb component in the sense that it's going to do absolutely nothing but taking an object. So import React from React. And then we'll say export function Pokemon. And do you remember that we passed in the object that was holding all the data for the Pokemon? Well, you did because in the task, you did it, right? So let's go ahead and destructure from the props that I passed down. So to destructure, we'll do this. And there we are. We have the Pokemon prop, which is just an object. And we can just do return. Do some, just a p tag here. Do json.stringify. Actually, let's go ahead and just request Pokemon.name. And that looks good to me. Let's go ahead and run. And there we are. We have all the Pokemon names. Fantastic. So well done there. What I'm going to set out for you right now is let's create a div that's called Pokemon inside there. Actually, you know what? Let me write this out so it's a little easier. So we want a div with the class name Pokemon. Inside here, we want the Pokemon name. So we want another div. And then we want some meta information, right? So we want the HP and we want the CP. So how would we do this? So inside Pokemon, we want a meta div. So if you go ahead and just do that, so the structure is going to look like this. So you're going to have a Pokemon. Inside that, you're going to have another div, which is called Pokemon, and we're going to do __ meta. We're going to be using the BEM syntax and jump out of Pokemon meta, and we'll go back to the Pokemon, and we'll say we want, well, let's have a look. Let's say we'll get the image too. And don't forget the name. So we're going to have one div, which is our outer div, which is the Pokemon. Inside there, we'll have the Pokemon meta and the image. And for the naming convention, we're going to do it like this. So you'll see here, we have the Pokemon name, meta image, double underscore right there. And you know what? Whilst we're here, let's do it. Let's throw in the attacks. So we'll say Pokemon attacks. Now, this is a fairly big challenge right here. And in the sense that there's a lot of code to be written. And I say a lot of code. Don't worry, it's fine. It's not too much. Maybe you're looking at maybe 10, 15 lines, but it's fairly a lot of code for someone who's never written React before. But if you've written React before, go ahead and go crazy with it. Now, don't worry actually about displaying the Pokemon.name or the meta, the image, the attacks. If you can just lay out these divs, that's completely fine. If you do manage to add in the meta, the image, the attacks, that's fantastic. So I'm going to pause the video here. Go ahead and just do the divs. It's fine. I'm going to come back probably in 15, 20 seconds, and we'll look at how we can do this. But try this yourself. Just try dumping out the data as well. See what you get. And I shall see you shortly. So welcome back. Hopefully you managed to at least attempt that. It's a fairly complicated one, so I don't want to just leave you alone attempting this. So let's work through it ourselves. So we want a div with a class name Pokemon. Okay, so let's just go ahead and just remove this for now. And we'll say div class name. And just to make it a little easier to read, let's put that down there. So div class name Pokemon. So that's the first one done. Perfect. And then inside that, I asked that you could create me a div class name of Pokemon __ name. That's good. And then after that, you wanted the meta. The meta being like the health, the crit points. After that, we wanted an image. So let's go ahead and create that div. And then after that, we wanted the attacks. And the double underscore is basically just saying with the BEM syntax, you'll have the block being Pokemon, the elements being the name, the meta, the image. So that's a double underscore. If you want a modifier at the end of that class name, do hyphen modifier. So for the image, you could have Pokemon _ image hyphen large. Pokemon _ image hyphen small. So that's the modifier in BEM. So attacks. Now you will be thinking right here, okay, well, attacks is multiple attacks. So how do we handle this? We're going to have to look at looping over using a map again. So for the name, let's just put in Pokemon.name. And then for the meta, let's just do some span. And we'll basically, let's get rid of those. And we'll handle the attacks in the next video. Right now, let's just take a look at how we can get the initial data. So next we want an image source, and we'll basically just pass Pokemon.image, and we'll give it an alt tag of Pokemon.name. And that looks good to me. We can clear out the comments, and let's run this. And there we are. We have our Pokemon name. We have the ID. Well, the max. So you can see here, we have the max HP, which is 1071, and then we have the crit points, which is 951, and then we have an image. So perfect. Well done on getting through that. We now have Pokemon data. In the next video, we're going to be looking at how we can add the attacks. Well done once more, and I shall see you in the next video. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can map over those attacks. So each Pokemon has attacks, which is just an object. Within that object, we have special attacks. So that's an array, and we want to get those values out of there. So how do we do that? So let's take a look. And we've done a map before, right? So we kind of know how to do this. So let's just attempt it. So let's just do Pokemon.attacks.special. because we know that from our query. We've requested this. And now what happens if there's many attacks? Well, we have to think about our UI in this example. How many attacks do we want to show? And probably a good limit is around maybe 3. So let's do a slice. We'll do slice 0 to 3. And we say .map. Now we want the attack. So we'll say, bring that down here. I'm going to say span. And of course, because this is a map, it has to have a key. I'll allow you to add that key because I want you to create that muscle memory. So right now, I'm going to leave that as it is. Go ahead and add the key. Now, I have to think about this. What did we get out of the GraphQL query that we can use? Because it has to be unique. So what can we use here? And a key doesn't just have to be a number. It can be anything. So maybe try combining that name and damage. So go ahead, and I'll be back shortly. Try that out. And I shall see you in a few seconds. So welcome back. Let me show you how to do this. If you managed to do it, fantastic. If you didn't, that's fine. You know, everyone's still learning. So let's do span key. And this one's a bit more complicated. So if you didn't manage to do it, do not worry. If we go ahead and open up our backticks, we shall do attack.name. I'm going to concatenate this with attack.damage, and that will give us a unique identifier, which is brilliant. Inside there, we're just going to say attack.name. Let's just see if that works. I semicolon at the end there, run code. If we scroll down, there we are. We have the power, the whip, the seed, the bomb, the sludge bomb. Fantastic. And you can see our Pokemon's right about now. We've got data, we've got somewhat of a structure, we've got the metadata, the attacks, the name. It's coming together. So well done on that. Very, very well done, actually, because that attacks object and the special object within inside was fairly complicated. So if you managed to do that, that's amazing. If you didn't, don't worry. It was very complicated, and we shall be picking up more stuff like this in the future, so don't worry, but fantastic. I shall see you in the next video. So welcome back. We have come quite a far way since this series started. So if you didn't know React before this, hopefully you picked up some of the core fundamentals like passing props, managing keys on components, and also just how to structure a React application. We've created containers, components, we've used the Apollo utilities such as useQuery. We've hit a GraphQL server, which is the Pokemon server. And now we've got an application that is bringing us data, and we have structured that data into a Pokemon component. And at this point now, we've pretty much created a fully working React application. Now we have to start styling this. So if we jump into app.css, you can see here we've got an application. And I just want to start out by just putting some resets in here. So let's just, for the moment, just begin with modifying the box size. So I'll put that to border box, then we'll set box sizing is border box. And down here, I'll just do some basic resets. And this just basically makes the container that we're working with on the right act accordingly and the same across different browsers. I always like to begin with resets. Now let's go into the body, and we'll say, body, we're going to give it some space. So we'll give it a margin, and then we'll give it some padding. Then we'll just put the line height to 1. And then we'll work with adding, let's add a font family in here. And let's go with this one for now. We can always change that if we deem appropriate. And we'll give it some color, and then we'll add the background color, and we'll say FB, 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 which is just a hex code for people who aren't too familiar with CSS. And then we'll smooth the fonts. And just to make sure it works in other browsers too, we'll say WebKit, font smoothing, anti-aliased. And then we'll say Moz for the Mozilla browser, which is Firefox. Let's say grayscale. And down here, we'll just say Pokemon. So let's do a better comment in this case. Let's do Pokemon application. And then we'll just close this. Likewise, we'll do this here for the resets. And it just makes it nicer and easier to read for people who are actually going through and reading your code. So we want to break this down in chunks. And for this video, I'm going to break it down by just going for the outer components first. And I say components, the outer model of the web page. So the container, we're just going to give this flex wrap, justify content, space between, and then we'll reset this now. So we'll just say for each paragraph tag that we've used, just give it a margin 0. Let's take a look. So CSS in Scrimba is actually updated live. So what we could do now, we could start working on our component, which is the Pokemon component. And we gave that a class name of Pokemon, if you recall. And we'll just give this a width of 49. And the reason we're giving it a width of 49 is because I want to have 2 Pokemons next to each other responsively. So we're going to work our way upwards here. Next, we're going to give it a border of 1 pixel. Then just go with 0.125. And this is all personal preference. You can make your application look however you want. And let's give it a nice box shadow, and we'll take 0.25 rem, RGB 0, 0, 0, and then we'll just say 0.075. And then we'll just make sure it's overflow hidden, and we're going to give it a margin bottom of 20 pixels. So this is the initial box, and we have a container and Pokemon. Now, we want to make sure that this is all working correctly and that we have fundamentally built something that is not just usable, but looks fairly nice. So let's just go in here. So we have a div class name of container. I'll just rerun this code here. Let's take a look. It should update live anyhow. Jump back into CSS. Now, if we give this a background color of red, we should be able to see. So I'm going to leave this here now and just come back in a second and see if you can figure out why this particular Pokemon hasn't gone red. So I'll give you a quick hint. So firstly, what I want you to do, go through and try debug this, because this is one of the most important aspects of programming, figuring out how to debug. So look for all the files, see if you can figure out exactly why the background color hasn't gone red. You can look through the index.html, see if that looks good. Is this okay? Then start debugging and looking down into things like the container. Is the container, does it have a class name? In this case, it does, so we know it's not there. What about the Pokemon? Let's jump into the Pokemon. It does have the Pokemon there. Okay, so what could it be? So hopefully you managed to look through that. Now I'm going to give you the solution here. Hopefully it was a fairly hidden one. And you'll find this a lot in programming, like here, link ref was actually link rel. So that was the solution. So if we go ahead, rerun the code in the mini browser, there we are, we have some styling. So that was all it is. But a lot of the time when you are programming, you'll come across these certain issues and they're hard to figure out. But generally, a lot of the time, they're just small little issues. So in here, we'll do Pokemon underscore name, background color, and we'll give this a ECD018. So that's just yellow. Text align center, padding 10 pixels. So that's looking pretty good. Let's just take a quick review. We've targeted the main card. We've targeted the Pokemon name. We want to target the image. We want to target the attacks and also responsively. So the next one we need to target here is the image and the p tag. So let's just go ahead and take this. So we're going to be targeting the inner p tag now. And what we're going to say here is that we want the p tag to say text transform, and we want it to be uppercase, font weight bold. I want the color to be white, less spacing. Let's put that at like 4 pixels. And we'll give a bit of a shadow as well. Give it the RGB 0, 0, 0, 0, 0.4. We don't want it to be too obvious that it's got some shadow on there. And then let's target the Pokemon image. We want it to be kind of separated, so we'll put some padding, the height on there, and we'll say display flex, align items so we can get it centered vertically. And we want to justify that content. So now it is aligned, but you'll see there's a quick issue with the image in this case. So how do we fix that? Now, if you haven't come across how to responsively deal with images, don't worry, I'll show you. But if you know how to do this, I'm going to pause the video. Even attempt it if you haven't done it before. Try attempt to get that image so it's in the center, it's squashed in the center. You can see the full image. So I'm going to pause the video now, and I want you to go ahead and attempt it. So welcome back. If you managed to do that, fantastic. If you didn't, that's fine. It's one of those issues you kind of pick up over time when you're dealing with CSS in the crazy world of CSS that is. So it's basically max width and we'll put height to auto and that should fix it for us. So well done if you managed that. If you didn't, that's completely fine. CSS is an entire language on its own. It's, so to say, it's very complicated and it just comes with experience, just like anything in programming and in life. So let's make sure we have the attacks. We want to get them so they're spaced in between. That's why I've used the justify content here, space between. Now we have to style those attacks, and if you remember, we put them in a span tag. And this one's going to be quite a big one because there's quite a lot I want to do with these. I want them to look fairly nice. I don't want them to look like they're just put on the page and not styled properly. So let's give that a border radius of 3px, padding of 7px, font width 700, and we'll give it a color of white so it stands out in that. That's looking good. Adding right, and we'll say 10px as well. And then let's make the font size 12 just so it fits better. Give it a margin bottom of 10px. Word wrap, we want to break that word so it doesn't mess up. And then we'll say text align center. And that looks good. We could even modify the line height just a tad right there. So let's put that actually to 20. Ooh, let's try 15. 15 looks good. I like 15. Okay, so next we need to do the meta, which is these here. And you'll see them separate shortly because even though they are collated next to each other, they are actually separate. So set display flex, justify content, space between, margin top, 10px, padding, 0, 10px. Perfect. Now again, we're going to have to style these just like we did with the attacks. So Pokemon, meta, span, let's say color white. So they're going to go for a second. Text shadow, just add something fairly inconspicuous on there. 0, 0, 0. We'll go for the same 0.4. Let's give it a nice background color. We'll say 7 BB, 7 BB, 7. Now say font weight bold, margin 0, padding 5. PX 20. Now let's try a different border radius on this one. Say border radius 5. And there we are. So it's looking pretty good, right? Doesn't work responsively, but we can fix that in the next video. So well done if you managed to fix that image. That's fantastic. If you didn't, no worries. Let's move on. And yeah, I shall see you in the next video when we look at how to work with this responsively. But well done getting this far. We've created a React application. It's looking really nice. We've got some styling. It looks very cartoonish, and that's the look we're going for. So well done, and I shall see you in the next video. Welcome back, and this is going to be the last video, and we're going to be looking at how we can responsively style our application. I want to give a massive shout out to you for actually making it this far. You've managed to create a fully working React application that hits a GraphQL server, and that's an incredible task that you have achieved. So well done, give yourself a pat on the back, and now let's finish this. Let's get that satisfaction of having a fully working responsive React application. So let's go ahead. Let's type media, and we'll say max width 800 pixels, which is px. And then we want to target the container, and then we want to target the Pokemon. And we'll say, okay, up to 800 pixels, we want it to be 100%. Previously, it was at 49%. Next, we want to do our last media, which is 400 pixels, and that's going to be really small, but I just want to make sure we adequately look after people with smaller devices. In this case, I'm going to double target here. So I'm going to go for the attacks and the Pokemon meta because they're quite similar. And we're just going to say flex wrap is equal to wrap. Again, I want to target container.pokemon, let's say meta span, and then we'll say do the same for the attacks. And lastly, we'll say Pokemon. So I'll make that 100% too. Once we've done that, let's just put a space in there so it's a bit easier to see. We'll say Pokemon, meta, span, margin, bottom, 10 pixels. And with Scrimba, this updates live. So you can see we have a fully working responsive application all the way down and all the way up. So once again, a huge congratulations to you finishing this course. You've managed to create a fully working React application. We've even styled the application. We've worked with Apollo. We've hit a GraphQL server. It's incredible. So give yourself a huge pat on the back for getting this far. You've done so well. And I am very proud if you made it this far and you've achieved, and hopefully you have learned a lot throughout this course. So congratulations once again. And hopefully you take this knowledge and apply it to other applications and just keep increasing your knowledge, keep building that muscle memory. So once again, the final time, congratulations.